Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem, the infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? Welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. As you probably know, this idea about Athens and Jerusalem is the relation between reason and faith. And this is also the main topic for this episode. We're gonna discuss a letter written by Pope John Paul II, the Catholic Pope. It's called an encyclical letter. It's written in 1989, and the name of the letter is Fides et Ratio, which means faith and reason. It is written or is promulgated in September 1998. And that means that it's not only John Paul II that has written it. It's other people from the Vatican that has also been part of the process of writing it. I would also say that this is the first time since 1879 that the Catholic Church has addressed the relationship between faith and reason. And on the podcast side, there's also a link that's possible to read the letter yourself. It's a pretty long letter, and we are just gonna focus on some of the perspectives. So please enjoy the conversation.
I'm glad you brought that up because I hadn't read this encyclical before. And it was very interesting to read. Very, very well written. Very
yeah, it was. Yeah. I was also
some very nice points.
impressed.
You know, it sums up a lot of what's been going on in the modern world. You know, sums up some of the problems with modernity. You know, gently presents the official Catholic solution to these problems. And I think as we may expect, it didn't solve any of the problems.
Oh,
I mean,
but I'm
I'm
very impressed by all the knowledge that is in the paper. That is
yes, it was a very
combined.
learned paper. Yeah. There must have been. Well, I'm sure Pope John Paul must have been a very learned man, and I'm sure he had a whole phalanx of bishops and cardinals. Yeah, helping doing the background research for this. It definitely has.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, such learned Catholics. I don't know how familiar you are with the works of Teilhard de Chardin, who was also a great, yeah. I think that, the Jesuits throughout centuries have had this dedication to knowledge, and many of them have been extremely learned and sharp as well. So
I sent my oldest daughter to a Jesuit university. I turned her
Ah,
over to the Jesuits for her intellectual training, but
okay.
it takes a very light touch on the Catholic angle. As far as I can tell, she's having as much of a secular education
Mm,
as anyone at any other
mm,
state university, say. I mean, except taking one theology class, there's really nothing else that makes it an explicitly theological or religious education. I guess it translates more into overall the student body is tilts Catholic, and you'll have a bit maybe the culture of the university in a sort of more fuzzy sense will be infused by the spirit of Christianity. I suppose that's the best case scenario.
mm.
But
But
she
but
hasn't come back talking about
yeah.
all the spiritual insight she's getting from the Jesuits.
But does she say something about the culture between the students? Are they more focusing on really to learn or to get knowledge, or do they? Is it like more or less like the same?
Yeah, I think you'll find that that'll be one positive outcome. It's not a party school. Um, and you'll find that at some universities in the US that, it really revolves around parties, fraternity life, football, and it's 4 years of debauchery, and then along the way somehow you get a degree. But Loyola Marymount is definitely much more, I guess, brainy and focused on education, and that's, I guess, where you can credit the Jesuits.
Mm. Yeah, I remember decades ago anyway, over a couple of decades ago when I lived in the UK for a while. Uh, there they had these Catholic grade schools, and it was interesting because lots of Muslim parents put their children there because these were schools that first of all had good discipline, very good academic standards, and then there was some sort of a spiritual input. So it was interesting that there were children from non-Catholic backgrounds also in
Mhm.
these schools.
Yeah.
Because that reminds me of one of the question about this paper that we are discussing.
Mm,
Because one of the problematic side, I would say, on the paper is that this discussion about faith and reason is a very Catholic way of thinking faith, or that you actually have to like accept some of the, especially the understanding of Jesus as God. One of the starting point from the religious position in chapter 1 is he says that Jesus, revealer of the Father. And I just wonder, do we need to go through Christ or Jesus to be able to experience God? Because if it's so, then okay, then it's only the Catholic way of thinking that, or the Christian way of thinking that is possible about this
and that's
paper.
that's that's of course, yeah. I mean that is definitely a sort of a central, I would say, theological question, really, but perhaps in one sense also an epistemological question. But
Mhm.
I think that it's not just Catholicism. I think all world religions essentially, in some way, see the founder of the religion as an intermediary between God and humanity,
Mm.
or as it says
Mhm.
here, as a revealer of God, in one sense or another.
And reading this as sympathetically as possible before maybe introducing criticism, I I think that the project of uniting faith and reason um, is, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to it, partly because if you look at the whole structure of what we might consider to be the most certain knowledge that we have, let's say the knowledge of mathematics, um, what does a mathematical proof consist of? A mathematical proof consists of axioms which are taken as given. Literally, they're axiomatic. And then there's all the chain of reasoning of mathematical reasoning that leads to the conclusions. That's the case in logic with premises and then hopefully a valid argument that's constructed with its conclusions. It's the case in physics, where you have initial conditions that then evolve in time according to the laws of physics to produce a prediction. And so we see that in any kind of systematic thinking, you have to have a starting point, and that starting point itself at some level has to be a given. It has to be something that you take as axiomatic, because otherwise you're just running in circles at some point. So you have to start somewhere. So I'll give them that they start from the standpoint of, okay, here's our starting point. Here's our premise. Our premise is that there is a historical moment of eruption of the divine into the world that we base our community's understanding around. So that in itself, I don't have any logical problem with. The question becomes, well, what do you do with that? It's not that they take Jesus as a source of knowledge. It's, well, what kind of knowledge, and where do their assumptions about the nature of the knowledge that Jesus brought, where do those assumptions lead us? That's something where I feel like the encyclical didn't really touch upon as much as it could have, and perhaps should have, if it really wants to engage in this dialogue and really address the tension that exists between faith and reason, between science and religion over the last few centuries. You should address how religious power has been abused in the service of enforcing a particular doctrine or dogma, to the detriment of reason, to the detriment of scientific thinking. I mean, the paradigmatic example, of course, being Galileo. And I didn't see really any discussion of that in the encyclical. And I think in part because how I'm reading it, now I'm sort of going from the sympathy piece to the more critique. The encyclical, I think, is starting from a particular standpoint, no problem with that. But the standpoint is that Christianity represents, as how did they put it in the encyclical? This is on page 20 of the encyclical, that the unity of truth is a fundamental premise of human understanding, as the principle of non-contradiction makes clear. That's in paragraph 34. And there may be even better examples of this, where they basically introduce the idea that Christian theology is a body of knowledge, a body of facts about the spiritual world, which is intrinsically logical in its structure, and that one can reason about using the principle of non-contradiction, which goes all the way back to Aristotle, to reach certain conclusions which are considered factual. And that seems to be, to me, one of the major premises of this whole encyclical, is this view about the nature of divine revelation. And that might seem axiomatic to some, that might seem like obvious to some, but to me, that's not an obvious premise to start from. And because I believe that it's possible to start from other premises about the nature of what we call divine revelation in its various manifestations across various religions historically that have appeared on the planet, of which Christianity is only one. And there's a way in which this encyclical is, as I suppose we can expect, exclusively speaking within that one particular spiritual tradition and that one particular viewpoint on the nature of divine revelation, which I think makes the conclusions from these premises difficult to cross boundaries into other modes of thought. It ends up becoming a kind of, well, we are in sole unique possession of the factual truth of things, and everything else ultimately is going to have to conform with this body of truth that we have. Again, that might seem like a kind of obvious saying. Well, of course the Pope would say that, but the fact is, we live in a multipolar world. We live in a world in which there are many, let's say, competing philosophies, many competing theologies even, and they may be competing at the level of theology, at the level of viewpoints of the divine, at the level of, well, is revelation even something which is a logically coherent body of knowledge? But nevertheless, these competing systems may end up in the conclusions from different premises in a way that's strangely aligned. Buddhism begins with a whole different set of premises about the nature of the divine, whether it's even a logically provable thing, a whole different set of premises, but the conclusions are eerily similar to the moral conclusions of Christianity. Love your neighbor, outward orientation, go out and serve the poor and the downtrodden. These like essential core ethical conclusions are coming from different premises. And I think that's an absolutely fascinating reality of the world that we inhabit. And if you stick to this one sort of rabbit hole of thinking, you're not going to be able to break out and I think have a real dialogue with people outside that tradition.
Yeah, I was just wondering what is the axiom that you are criticizing? Yeah, and what is the different way of thinking in the Buddhistic way?
Well, I'm not at all an expert on Buddhism, but from what I understand on the superficial level that I've explored I don't understand Buddhism as starting from the same sort of premise of Catholic theology, that there's a logical cause of causes that brings creation to being with certain purpose, that there was from the beginning a sort of a counter purpose that gives rise to sin, that requires a whole divine theophany and divine economy of how the divine works in the world to mitigate that sin and bring it to an ultimate purpose. I mean, there's a whole sort of way of thinking derivative of Catholic theology that is not present in Buddhism. As far as I understand, Buddhism doesn't even start from the premise of there being a creator God who has a certain plan for the world, and that's that's the rock bottom, like fundamental of all Christian theology. But what's fascinating to me is that Buddhism can start from this premise, which is not a theistic premise, but nevertheless end up at like such a similar place in the moral sphere. And I think that's a data point that if we don't like really consider that data point, then we may be missing something really important. It may then be much more plausible for us to figure, well, yes, there's competition in these theological systems. Well, it must be the case that one of them is correct and the others are false. And that flows from the premise stated in the encyclical in paragraph 34 about this principle of non-contradiction. I mean, which is, I think, also partly why there's such an emphasis on Thomism in Catholic theology. Thomas Aquinas, very logical person, laying out the reasoning and the chain of argument, and that's very congenial with the idea of divine revelation being, a factual body of logically consistent information that can be unfolded with the right amount of thought. And so you have this, the work of Aquinas and everything that follows upon that premise. But I think Buddhism and Eastern philosophies in general don't start from the premise of Aristotle that the principle of non-contradiction applies in the spiritual realm. And that might seem to like open the door to all sorts of woolly anything goes thinking. I don't believe that that's the case, but I do think it opens the door to like profound thoughts about the nature of spirituality, which are also eerily present in modern day physics. I think it was Niels Bohr who said something along the lines of, everyday truths are those whose opposites are falsehoods, but the deepest truths, such as the truths of, say, quantum mechanics, are those whose opposites are equally true. The particles versus waves, how you look at the world and how the world appears to you is fundamentally a function of how the observation is set up. That's like a weird idea, but that idea is abundantly confirmed by the physical evidence that we have. And that idea, I think, is much more in alignment with more Eastern philosophies than these Western, I think, logic-bound theologies that want to put everything into crisp categories, that want to line up all the logical proofs for God's existence and existence of the soul and so forth. And those may go a certain distance in terms of taking human action and behavior and incentivizing and aligning human behavior in a direction which may ultimately be in the direction of reality, but it's always subject to how valid the premises are, and I'm not sure the premises. I guess I wouldn't expect even a papal encyclical to question its own premises, but if you don't take that step, you aren't aware, I think, of the fact that there's a whole constellation of other modes of theological thought out there which may be valid on their own terms, and that possibility seems to be excluded by this encyclical. The encyclical wants to say, no, there's one correct theology. It's the magisterium, as they call it, of Catholicism, which guarantees correct, true, infallible knowledge that then has to be translated into terms that everyday people can understand.
Yeah. If I understand you correctly, but I would say that these premises are more connected to monotheism, maybe, and so it might not be Catholic or Christian way, but it is a monotheistic way of thinking.
Absolutely. You look at Judaism, look at Islam, and their theologies, I think, are very much sister theologies to Catholicism, because they start from the same kinds of premises, that there's a creator God, that there's a logical coherence to divine revelation, that the principle of non-contradiction applies, I think is, I believe, equally a premise of all the Judeo-Christian Islamic, let's say, Orthodox thought.
And I think there is a sort of an underlying, how would say, tension or almost a paradox in this otherwise very thought-provoking, many ways very thought-provoking letter or statement, and that is that on the one hand it tries to open up to some sort of an almost ecumenical acceptance of others and trying to bring reason and faith together, but at the same time it has to somehow argue for the uniqueness of the Catholic position and the fact that if it's not the only truth, it is, so to say, the best truth, and something along those lines, because it cannot somehow conclude that, well, there are several alternative ways of reaching the same goal, which are equally good as Catholicism or Christianity. So I think this creates a sort of a tension between being open and yet sort of using that openness as a way to then arrive at the conclusion, yes, but in this open terrain, the best place to arrive at is the position that we hold. But I would now, for the time being, put that. I thought that at the very beginning of this letter, there was a point that at least made me think, because I had never really thought of it in these terms, and I thought that was something, maybe a point which could genuinely bring together, and as you were, Stephen, saying so beautifully, that sort of genuinely bridges these dichotomies and bring them together. And that was the point where the Pope states that this question of know thy, or this injunction, know thyself, or this question of who am I as a human being, is and then he's saying, and I thought that was very beautiful, this idea that in some essential way, what defines our humanity is that we ask that question. Because I think part of and if you now talk about Athens and Jerusalem, especially in relation to education, I think one of the central problems and lacks in our educational systems is the fact that this very central question is almost totally neglected. And we have touched upon this briefly in previous conversations that we have had. So in our current educational system, at least unless you're attending some sort of a super religious educational school, you learn lots of things about everything outside yourself, from the atoms to the galaxies, but you actually learn almost nothing about yourself as a human being. If
agree.
you so
I,
so
I,
so
yeah.
that's I think that's maybe this is where we could start somehow, like what are the ways in which different approaches come together in helping us understand who we really are.
I also thought that was, I really like that when he start a letter on this question about connecting faith and reason, then they actually start by asking, know yourself. If we understand that this is like a monotheistic religious way of thinking, I also think it's in many ways a pretty monotheistic way of thinking reason. And I think that's something that Stephen was telling us by Niels Bohr. And Immanuel Kant, he says something very similar that the Pope. He says that human is a species that's ask question they are not able to answer. And I think that's like the essence of man. So and I think he is also like a monotheistic thinker.
Yeah, I do agree that this is one of the strongest points that the encyclical makes, and maybe we should started with this point of strong agreement before proceeding to any sort of philosophical criticism, and that is, I do believe it makes a valid critique of the modern world and the epistemological movement that was taken, starting with Galileo and the architects of modern science, to as an epistemological move to reduce observation to that which can be quantified and that which can be objectively gathered and shared with others. To take the quality out, to take the subjective component out as much as possible in order to create a space for conversation and dialogue and experimentation and everything, which has led to, over the ensuing few hundred years, undeniably and staggeringly powerful results in terms of getting at how the physical universe works. But that epistemological movement of bracketing out things like consciousness, things like mind, soul, all the things that the theologians wanted to talk about, certainly bracketing out God, bracketing it out a concept of a divine entity acting in the world, because these things can't be measured, they can't be quantified. And so the initial step in the sort of as the scientific project was underway was to bracket these things out. And scientists would argue, well, based on the stunning results, it looks like we made the right decision to bracket these things out. But I think what this encyclical correctly points out is that if you follow that thread, and then if you follow where it has gone culturally, it is transformed from an epistemological move to becoming a metaphysical or ontological claim. So, and I think we've talked about this in past sessions. Philip Goff has written about this. The title "Galileo's Error" I think sums up the idea. An error, maybe it was a simplification that that was useful and that is still useful. But we have to ask what sort of world does it describe, and is it adequate to describe the world that we actually inhabit? And here's where now I think it's much more fashionable to admit that the world described by science, the quantitative world that produces like incredible technological feats, that produces predictions on the order of a dozen decimal places, I mean, stunningly accurate predictions, they're getting something right. But at the same time, the world that's being described by science doesn't include the most important things to us. It doesn't include our own consciousness. It doesn't include our sense, deeply felt by so many, of there being some axial dimension to reality. By axial dimension, I mean there's a dimension of transcendence to reality. There's a sense of there being a directionality in the cosmos that draws humanity forward in a particular way. That directionality can be summed up in the word love and unity. And none of this is visible in the equations of science, in the equations of physics, and in the theories. And I think the encyclical correctly points out that if you agree that that epistemological move is actually ontologically valid, then you're left with a very kind of empty universe, a universe of matter only, which, well, I mean, to put it frankly, is depressing. It leads to all sorts of disconnects with the world that we actually inhabit as human beings. You know, we want to and need to live in a world in which our minds mean something and are not just epiphenomena and accidental additions of some evolutionary process. We need to live in a world that has meaning. And the scientific picture of the world is by construction doesn't have meaning to it. That meaning has to be added in by us. But if we decide that that scientific picture of the world is the only reality, then it excludes the possibility of talking about meaning. You can just toss it out and say, okay, that's just superstition. That's just superstition. And we end up with the kinds of, I don't know, the kind of mental, almost the mental problem that the present day has, the kind of like widespread depression, the widespread sense of disconnect, and the sense of like the foundations having been pulled out. And I think Nietzsche did such a really wonderful job of diagnosing what was going on, say, with European civilization in the mid-19th century. Well, the theological foundations are pulled out. So what's left? We're still acting as though the system of values undergirded by Christianity is still valid, but it's really not anymore if the foundations are gone. And so it takes a few generations for that to go away. But we're seeing the effect of that now. It's that slow motion collapse of a building. Once you blow out the foundations and you see the thing collapsing slowly at first and then all at once. We're in the all at once phase. And we're in a world that's been drained of meaning for a while now, but now we're seeing the real after effect of that, which is that no one even believes in truth anymore. I mean, we're left to our own devices. We seem incapable as a society of even coming to consensus on what facts are anymore. And that's a real problem. I believe the encyclical does, although it's not so much addressing because it came before that. It's not so much addressing the problem with the social media and all of that, but it could very well include that kind of analysis in its overall analysis of modernity and the I don't know, the disease of modernity in a way. That's not quite the right word, but
the end of the first, or the introduction, he says that we are preferring quick success to the toil of patient inquiry into what makes life worth living. And it has something to do with acceleration also, that everything is becoming more and more rapid, and social media is part of that acceleration. And then it's more and more difficult for a human being to have the patient.
Yeah. And that brings us back to this whole epicenter of this podcast. What I take to be like the epicenter of this podcast is we're living in a world which is drained of meaning, drained of spirit. The scientific project, the scientific culture would say, so much the better, good riddance. But we feel like a baby has been lost along with the bathwater. And the question is how to bring the baby back. Well, what is the baby? First of all, how to bring the baby back? How to bring back into the conversation talk of spiritual things, but is it going to be on the terms that this encyclical is offering? Those terms I would submit are not terms in which we can have a modern conversation of reintroducing the spiritual into the world, because those terms are fundamentally tribal. I think in the technical sense of the word. I mean, they're tribal in the sense that they're centered around a particular dogmatic formulation, which is not the dogmatic formulation that everyone in the world is ever going to subscribe to. And so you're either going to say, well, ours is, I'm sorry, but our dogmatic formulation is the correct one. It's going to win in the end, and we're going to stick to our guns. Or we're going to go back and re-examine the premises and find out, okay, how can we bring spirit back in, even at the level of education, which I think rightly has been bracketed out in secular educational models, because we don't know how to bring spirit in without also bringing the dogma in. If we figure out how to bring spirit back into the conversation and leave out the dogma, I think that's the essence of the problem, the essence of the question.
And I think this issue of dogma, in a sense, is also a problem with science. It's very interesting because there's been a lot of critical historical analysis of religious thinking, and very well so. But I think there's been much less of similar analysis of scientific thinking. And I think that in my simple mind, this sort of strongly empirical approach to science, which has its counterpart in education, in the early development of educational thought, which was very behavioristic, where we actually did tests with animals and try to draw conclusions from those to human beings, because that was something that was easy to observe and quantify. I think these were good first steps of the child starting to walk, because they gave us a point of reference other than just like some people's imagination of or interpretation of what they want the truth to be. So it gave some sort of actually it's very interesting that this very thing that has led to this extreme relativism, in a way, I think just try to point out to another reference point for certainty than the kind of arbitrary absolutism, one could say, of religious thinking. But I think that as science has developed, for instance, if one thinks of most of the formulations that Einstein came up with, and the whole modern physics, they were not based on empirical evidence. On the contrary, they were based on just Einstein's sort of, I would say, I don't know, thought experiments or his thinking process. And many of these formulations were possible to be empirically verified long after he died. So I think in some way it shows that scientific thinking is not really the same as empiricism. Just like educational thinking or educational theory building is not the same as behaviorism. These are, I think science has that also, its own developmental history. And we have to, so I think in the end, we maybe arrive at a point which more easily brings science and spirituality, or science and metaphysics, together. And I think that's why I thought that this question about who are we, or know thyself, is very essential, because I think somehow, no matter which path we take, one central place which we end up at is the human mind. And that is something more than just the human brain, although the brain is definitely involved in the process. But there is this ability of human beings to think abstractively, to imagine things that don't exist, and this whole human thought process, which is amazing, I think, and like we don't probably wonder about it enough. I think that is sort of central to this whole concept of meaning. It's central to finding order in the universe. It's central to everything that really makes us human. So I think that maybe somewhere there we can find a meeting point between these different approaches.
He do write on in number 88. He writes about scientism, and I think scientism is what you refer as empirism or positivism. understood that in a way it is when science become the new or the only religious faith in society. There are some positive things with scientism, and it's especially to remove when we explain things out of metaphysical premises. But that's not what we are trying to do by faith. It's not like explaining reality or explaining what's happening in real life by saying that it's something that is the gods have done towards us or something like that. But of course, that was a necessarily important part of the transformation of science in the 16th and 17th century. But I think we should go back even a little bit more to the starting point of the letter, what you are, this idea about knowing yourself. And I think also he points out that and number 3, he says that men and women have at their disposal an array of resources for generating great knowledge of truth so that their lives may be ever more human. And I really like that idea that philosophy is not something that is for philosophers, but it's actually for every human being. Every human being have like a philosophy dimension. I think that's part of the purpose of the podcast, is to actually to try to discuss these questions, I say more or less, without referring always to different kind of theories or philosophical positions. But of course, we often end there. We do. But if you try to remove some of it, he connects God with truth. We can start with that axiom that is there a connection between truth and God?
Maybe it's not just a connection, but an identity. Conran could say more authoritatively, but in Persian, hak is a word which is translated as true or truth. It's also translated as God. So check the dictionary on that, and it's the same. The same word is used, and depending on context, you have to decide if you're talking about God or if you're talking about truth, or maybe the true one, to try to capture a little bit of both. So there's certainly cultures and I don't know, systems of thought, entire languages that already invite us to make that identity between truth and the ultimate, and what in some languages is called God.
Yeah, and of course, if we try to think the opposite, to say that could it be like something divine that is also false? And then they would say that no, okay, in this, the same second you would say that no, it's not divine if it's false.
Yeah, you can almost say by definition, the divine is that which is true. I guess we're back to the Euthyphro argument from Plato. Do the gods love it because it is true, or is it true because the gods love it? And that's which has precedence. Do the gods exist before truth, and then, well, truth is just whatever the gods say it is by divine fiat, or are the gods themselves in some way constrained to the truth? Is the truth something which supersedes even our notion of the gods? And that's an original philosophical question that I'm not sure has been answered over the succeeding millennia.
No, and I don't think it's ever going to be. It's one of those questions that we can't answer. But that's what makes us human, and that's also what makes everybody into a philosopher. I won't even start by explaining what I understand by like a professional philosopher, but he does mention that they do exist. But then the next idea is that there's a connection between God and love.
Well, I think that's also is an identity in the Bible, which was it one of the, is it First John or something? God is love. It's just given as an equation. Both of these ideas, God is truth, God is love, to me, it invites a way of thinking about God very usefully as going beyond God as a being in the static sense, existing outside of space and time with some sort of divine intention, with some sort of active connection with the world, with who observes, who decides, who listens, and so forth. And it takes us more into the realm of the divine, not so much in the grammatical category of a noun, but more in the grammatical category of a verb. God and truth as well, not like a static collection of facts, but something which is dynamic and evolutionary, not in some random sense, which is all that modern science can deliver, is random motion in the end, but motion that has some overall directionality to it. That's truth, is aligning one's actions with that overall directionality, which is in some way embedded in the cosmos. Just like, we know that entropy is some directionality embedded in matter. Everything writ large is running down. Energy is equilibrating between all the different possible states which it can occupy. But somehow we also observe and suspect, looking at cosmic evolution, biological evolution, human evolution, we suspect that there is something which tends towards the upbuilding of matter at the same time. The increasing complexity of matter in the biological sense is one of the, I think, signposts in this direction, all of which indicates to me that there is the wind is blowing in a particular direction. It's invisible, but you can see the effect of that wind. And that's what I would call truth. And truth is that we align ourselves in the direction of that invisible wind that pervades, whose traces are visible. I was, like when you're in more sunny climes than Portland, where they have palm trees, and sometimes you see clusters of palm trees, and it's often the case that these palm trees all tilt in the same direction, and which is a very strange phenomenon if you think about it. It's like, why would they all decide to tilt in the same direction? Well, it's because there's a prevailing wind that tends, as these palm trees are growing, to tip it over in a particular direction. And that's why. But if you didn't know about the wind, it would be a very curious phenomenon that all these different palm trees are leaning in the same direction. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're faced with when we look for evidences of truth in the world, is we see it manifested in different ways. And if we connect the dots, and there's different ways of connecting the dots, but one way of connecting the dots, for example, looking at the overall moral foundations of all the great world religions, irrespective of theology, tend to be very similar. The golden rule is found in all the great religious traditions. Why? That's the tilt of the palm tree. I think it can be taken as evidence for there being some directionality to things. Over time, with enough people and working together to build a civilization, certain things emerge as being directionally correct. And I think truth and love are very much, to me, connected to that idea of the divine. I would say, as opposed to this idea of the divine as a static entity who loves and cares and so forth. But I don't want to at the same time say, well, this is the right way to think about it and that's the wrong way to think about it, because this other way of thinking about the divine also motivates human behavior directionally in the same way. Those who think of God as a being out there who is actually observing my every action, potentially judging it, who is manifest in the world through a series of prophets or a prophet and a sacred text that tells me what to do, and that has an ecclesiastical hierarchy that carries forward that divine guidance and so forth. It's easy to logically undermine that way of thinking, but you can't deny the good result as well as the bad results. But I think on the balance, the good results of that way of thinking, which is to align human behavior in the direction of that invisible wind that pervades the cosmos, in the direction of love and consideration for one's neighbor, which in some mystical way, I think, is part of the cosmic process of the upbuilding of things, which ultimately ends where? Well, it ends, I think, with know thyself, the starting point of this encyclical. But what is the self that's being known? The self that's being known is ultimately the cosmos itself. But now we're jumping off into the deep end of
But
Teilhard de Chardin
but
and others, I think, also saw it this way.
but isn't it possible to understand this connection between God and love and God and truth in the Catholic perspective, more in the line of what you are saying than more than this personalized God?
If I may just bypass that question, which I think is because I think it's a very big question that might require a whole session of its own. But just to maybe in the way of wrapping up some of these things that we've been touching, I think what Stephen was just referring to me is an important aspect of understanding I mean, knowing who we are and what our humanity is about, because I think um, Stephen was referring to one essential baby that has been thrown away with the bathwater, and that is this concept of a grand scheme or a grand story, uh, or there, as you said, there being directionality to things. I mean, it's so obvious even in nature, like you plant a seed and the seed has the potential and the directionality of becoming a tree and bearing a fruit. And if you don't understand that, then like we couldn't even have agriculture going on. So that now, because this idea of a grand story has been misused by people in order to exercise power over others, I think is no reason to say it's just like like because people have misused science that we should throw away science altogether. So I think this is essential, because I think that it is impossible to really know yourself or find meaning in your life if you cannot find the historical context of what it not just generally means to be a human being, but what it really means to be a human being in today's world, and what does it require of you being a human being today. Because just like what is requires of you being a human being at the age of 2, and what it requires of you to of being human being at the age of 22 or 62, there are different things, although you're a human being all the time. And if you don't understand at the age 22 that something other is required of you than when you were 2 years old, then you've got big problems. So I think that it's very important that we be able to place our humanity, its possibilities and its challenges in the historical context of this uh yeah this directional process to which you were referring, Stephen. And because we might come to the conclusion that being alive as a human being exactly at this time in human history might be one of the most wonderful and exciting things that could have happened to us. And
I
that
believe
it
that it
makes
is,
it
absolutely.
possible for us to understand things. I mean, having this kind of a conversation in 3 different countries, like and this whole, I mean, even just what we're doing right now is something that could have never before happened in human history. And I think yeah, so there's there's something very wonderful about our times. It's very easy, when you look at the news, to become extremely depressed about what is happening in our times. But I think that if you see the true potential and possibility of the evolutionary stage at which humanity is today, it could open up new hope and also sort of a new incentive to live up to our humanity to the degree that we can today and should today.
That's such a beautiful place to end. It's a positive note. I mean, we're living in an age of incredible, like endless possibility, but also endless problems. Which are existentially severe. I mean, we could actually destroy ourselves in a number of different ways within a generation or two, or within moments. And that makes these sorts of problems not just philosophical meanderings, but but real, they have real bite to them.
Yeah, I agree. And it's often you, Cameron, that ends the sessions with like trying to bringing everything together.
It's a
Like,
pleasure when my dear friends have provided all the pieces, then it's very easy just to be the one that
uh,
puts
but,
them,
but maybe also that we
together.
should say that to the listeners, I think is important, and I think I guess most listeners to our podcast will be critical and think by themselves and actually try to use their own thinking. I'm very happy that I have this 1 hour a month to talk with you, because unfortunately, in many ways, this is like the hour I have got to talk about these kind of questions, even though they sometimes are in my head. Maybe it's because I'm trying to plan of some of the sessions we have also, or to read these kind of letters from the Pope. But and it gives me joy, and it gives me meaning in many ways. And I really hope that the listeners also that our conversation could bring in some kind of meaning to their life. And if there's also the possibility to get in touch with us, I think on the webpage you could find my email and write to me if there's some questions or something, some thoughts you have on our discussions.
That was a great comment, and what you said about the the significance of these monthly sessions, I think you speak for all three of us. I think we all gain the same way and look forward to these meetings. And thank you so much, dear Knut Ove, for being the one who makes them actually physically possible. That's a
Thank you.
thank you very much.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.